Welcome to AIAP Show and Tell, a behind-the-scenes look at how America's best architectural photographers create their amazing photographs. Today's presentation is by elite architectural photographer, Sterling Stevens. Sterling, take it away.
Thank you to Alan and AIP for having me. My name's Sterling Stevens. I'm based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and San Antonio, Texas. And this is a shoot for a very long time client, Little, who I guess, despite the name, is a pretty big firm, and actually is one of the first big firm I work with, and one of the first firms I've worked with, just period. And they've been kind of instrumental in helping launch my career very kind of early. And the shoot that I'm talking about is an interior shoot called the Trillion Operations Center. And as you can tell, it's a former retail anchor store, specifically in Macy's, located in what's called Haynes Mall in Winston-Salem. And shot this in June of 2023. And this story did not started out very well from the beginning. My assistant and I, we were doing about 3 different shoots in the area in 3 days, and this is the 3rd day of the shoot. On the second day, second evening rather, I was having some dinner, and about 10 minutes in, my lips started tingling, and I was like, "Uh-oh, I have a nut allergy." And that night was really bad. I became violently ill. I contacted the architect by text and email. I was like, I have no idea if the shoot's going to happen at all the next morning. I did not get very much sleep, of course, and I felt well enough to actually continue to shoot. They kind of checked on me. I was like, look, if we can start just like a half hour later, like, we're good to go. So I told my assistant, I'm like, look, you're gonna have to help me kind of get through this. So picked up some Gatorade, some crackers from the supermarket, and that was gonna be what I did for the day. And so because of kind of like the geographical range of my projects, I typically don't scout a lot of my projects. And so, I'm usually kind of seeing things a day off. But a lot of times, they'll send me things in preparation, such as floor plans, with the obligatory arrows. And, they'll send renderings as well. And when I got to the site, I hadn't had any site photos. It was basically all floor plans and renderings. And, when I got in there, I was like, oh, well, there's like this big, huge staircase and there's a skylight in it. And I noticed that going back and forth between like the floor plans and the renderings, there's nothing looking at the staircase. And it's not like a glorious staircase, but, it's definitely part of the structure. And so pretty much all the arrows were pointing away from the staircase. And, like a lot of the renderings were kind of ancillary. The thing that I do like about like working with Little is they're not necessarily married to like the arrows and the renderings. They're really much more guidance than anything else. They really trust their photographers. And on site we had basically my assistant, the architect, the interior designer, and then also their client as well, who was on site. So we just kind of started off I was like, let's just do an easy shot. Let's just get this thing going. And we spent, while we were setting up, I spent probably about a good 45 minutes walking around with the architect. So, we got a pretty late start. And so, we basically focused on the basement level, just get a couple of quick shots. And then, another shot kind of out downstairs, kind of featuring the staircase. They want to kind of, get diversity of, types of spaces as far as, the private booths, the jewel box, the graphics, different types of furnishings and everything like that. And and then we get into some of the more difficult shots, and we're starting to change things up a little bit. So these are some of the original renderings around the entry. But of course, with renderings, the materials don't necessarily do what they actually do in real life. And so these are actually looking towards a parking lot, which is full of cars, and it's just gigantic reflections. So these 2 shots, I want to say, probably took about an hour and a half. So we changed up kind of just the angle because we couldn't necessarily just shoot towards the window. But in this area where that vestibule is, in order to pull this shot off, we had to completely black out that entire thing. And that took a lot of setup. And it was really the only time that we could do it because, as things, kind of progress during the day with lunchtime, people are going to be, that's the main entry. So people are going to be coming in and out. And so we really had to kind of set that one up. And so by the time we're doing all of this, the interior designer is getting a little bit kind of concerned because I think we we're commissioned for about 13 shots, and by about 11:30 we had done about 4 or 5, so we're definitely kind of running behind. And during this whole time, I noted to the architect, I was like, look, I definitely think we should definitely do like a 1 point on the staircase once it becomes like high noon, featuring the jewel box and everything like that. And the architect was on board. The interior designer, on the other hand, definitely was not as committed. And she was like, well, we've got the staircase kind of featured in other different shots. And so it was right after these shots that the architect has architect things to do, and he goes. And so now I'm just basically like with the interior designer, and I'm sure I'm not coming off great. I'm probably pretty grumpy after everything that's happened over the last 12 hours. And there's different interior design and graphics that need to be focused on that we really haven't gotten to yet. And she's understandably getting nervous, and she starts framing up pictures with her cell phone. This is like one of those little red button things that kind of, in the back of your mind kind of irritates you and things like that. And, we're kind of bumping heads a little bit. But it's about noon. And even though we're behind, I'm like, look, we should really kind of like set up the shot. And she thinks we should continue it. I got to a point, I was like, look, y'all can like fire me later, but we got to get the shot right now. And, so we had about 15 minutes. So this shot, it's December now. You can't get the shot in December just because of the low light, right? And so, right around, I want to say about 12:30, 12:45, we set up this shot. And so, as far as the technical aspects of it, it's pretty simple. Like most of the shot, I was saying like with the lights and shadows, is basically, one shot. I've blended in the office space that you can kind of see to the left. That's Miles, my assistant, and the client to the left-hand side. And then in the jewel box, what I wound up having do is Miles stood in the jewel box, basically popped a light to the left here to get one side, popped another light to the right here. And then that's kind of how we got some of the light in there. And that just took Miles out in Photoshop. The yellow that you see in the left that kind of has a hint of the graphics, that was completely dark, and so we wound up just kind of popping a light in here. And then since it was noon, there are people kind of going up and down for lunch, so I just kind of waited for people to hit the marks that I wanted to just kind of line everything up. And so after taking this shot, the interior designer really liked the shot. And actually wound up being one of her favorites, if not the favorite of the shoot. And so after that, things kind of calmed down, right, for both of us, sort of thing. We continue to shoot. So instead of kind of bumping heads, we're collaborating together, right? We're saying, we're working with, we're basically designing the photos together, focusing on what she wants, adjusting things like, hey, we've already featured this stair a couple times. Why don't we go to the other side and kind of feature the graphics? And so the shoot just wound up going a lot smoother. We're just kind of going back and forth. Things such as, okay, well, this office space is kind of boring, right? So instead of doing the office space, let's go tuck the office space in the background, highlight some of those wall graphics in the background, but also show in conjunction with the diversity of different spaces, right? As far as private spaces and how people can kind of walk past, and that idea, they're in finances and banking, and so like the idea of transparency, right? And then this is the shot that she really wanted to get. And, at first I wasn't on board, but, this was the last shot we wound up taking, and it wound up working great. And over the past couple of years, Little has used both this shot and that center shot in a lot of their just marketing, like whenever they get like, whether top, whatever, sort of firms, or if they're talking about adaptive reuse. And, with I know when a lot of people kind of look at this shot, they're really just focused on like, hey, this is, a staircase. But, these mall buildings, when you're talking about adaptive reuse, there's not really much to it, right? It's just four walls, two concrete slabs, and a roof, and with a hole punch in the middle, right? Like there's not much that you're actually really doing there. But these mall buildings, like the escalator was the heart of these buildings, and all the department stores were kind of like the arteries that kind of came off of it. And architecture is about showing what decisions and what choices were made. And there was a choice made here, right? Like they didn't have to keep the skylight. They didn't have to keep the hole that was in the middle. It could have been just as easy square footage. They could have said, okay, well, we're just going to keep the natural light on the third floor. They chose not to do that. They chose to keep it, right? And to kind of keep the heart of the building. And because of that decision, it impacts everything else that did it around it, right? Like it impacts all the design. It keeps the heart of the building. And so my argument is not really about the staircase. This is really about the light itself in and of itself. And so, our task, as photographers is really to showcase, a lot of those decisions to show the value of architecture, even if they're just really kind of simple decisions, to their clients. And, in addition, it also shows the value, of us as photographers, in helping to share those things. And so, this is kind of a chaotic shoot, but it worked out well. And in fact, the next 5 or 6 hours, we wound up doing about 17 shots at the end. So we actually did four more. So, it was very bumpy at the beginning, but it kind of came out together at the end. So that's basically the story behind taking this shot.
One thing that strikes me, Sterling, about this is that you started out from a really difficult situation when you started this photo shoot. And you came out with a really successful outcome, which I think that speaks to your professionalism. But this could have gone really bad, really fast.
It was. I was losing control of the shoot. And I was also very cognizant of it as well. And I can get into my moods too. And so you don't want to exacerbate the situation.
And one thing that I think most people know that you were an architect, but for those listening to this, they may not know that you have an architectural background. And I think that's the understanding that you have about the space, I think informs a lot of what you did as a photographer, and the decisions that you made about explaining the space through the photographs. So to me, that was really insightful when you talk about kind of bringing the interior designer around to the fact of including that staircase and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and also everybody has their point of view too, right? A lot of many of my shoots, the client is on hand, and so it just depends who you're talking to, and if they participate, whether it makes a difference whether they participate in the project or not. It makes a difference whether they're the marketer. Clearly the architect had different priorities than the interior designer, right? But like the task for me is kind of to see all of those things, right? No matter what each individual, person is kind of focused on, like you just kind of have to tie it together.
Now, some of you may not know, but we're featuring this shot actually on the AIAP homepage right now. I was really impressed with this. And one of the things that impressed me about this is this looks like a single exposure. Clearly, this is a complex photograph. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of walk us through the different exposures that you've made here.
Yeah, and I'm doing this off of memory because I don't have the layered files anymore. I keep them for about a year before I dump them. I would say, let's see. because I mean this was high noon, and so the skylight is, I guess, a story and a half above this. And so, one exposure was basically like this. So like the light and the shadow on the white walls, the columns, and the stairs, that's pretty much all one exposure. The office that's in the background on the left with the acoustical ceiling, that is a completely separate exposure.
Mm,
We did no lighting there. I just basically took another exposure and then just kind of brought it up and blended that in.
okay.
The Miles and the client there on the left is another separate exposure.
Okay.
The person that's walking is another exposure. The jewel box in the center are two different exposures. Again, so basically, I Miles took a strobe because there's a lot of reflections going on.
Mm-hmm.
There's reflections behind me, as you can tell. So we want to get some of those reflections off. So I had Miles stand in the left corner of the jewel box
Mm-hmm.
to pop while they're talking to each other, and then I had him stand to the right hand side and pop directly off the ceiling. And then I blended that together. So that's why you see that kind of light in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's basically the shot.
That's a lot. I mean, honestly, that's a lot going on, and it looks so seamless. Um, but that's a beautiful shot.
Thanks.
And compositionally, it's such a striking shot to me, that 1 point perspective, that I can see why your client gets a lot of mileage out of this, and this is one of the reasons that I was so taken by it and wanted to feature it on the website. And I'm glad that you chose to talk about this today.
I love the way that you framed the jewel box right in the middle between the stairs. Like everything, all the lines are drawing us right to there. The subjects on the left are looking in, which I really love. Yeah, everything about it's really nice. So way to go there. I'm curious, when you get onto production and you haven't been able to scout a location like this before, how do you choose where you're going to start and how you're going to progress through your day?
Oh, every single one is different. I mean, honestly, so what I typically get is I'll get, floor plans, and any site photos and renderings. And because if I understand where north is basically, like I understand kind of like what's supposed to happen as far as the light. Like I'm pretty good with pre-visualizing what the light is going to do any time of the year, essentially, right? But when you get onto site, sometimes you're like, oh, okay, well, this is what the space is actually doing, right? And so that's part of why, like in this scenario, I took an extra 45 minutes to just kind of walk through because, when you're seeing the renderings, you're just seeing like one image at a time. When you're going through the space, you have an idea of like where things are, how far away they are. In this case, like I was sick and I just wanted to get this thing going. So I was like, let's just get a win for this first shot, sort of thing. But also I tend to try to do a lot of the hard stuff first. I'm wide awake, I'm hopped off on coffee or whatever it might be. Like, but those are also the things that take the longest time, right? Like I just had a shoot in Nashville where it was basically like it was this wood form and it goes into the classroom and there's glass. And so when I was scouting it actually the day before, and you could tell that like the light was going to reflect into the glass, and you couldn't see into it. So what we did was we camped out at 5 o'clock in the morning while the building was empty, photographed it while you could see everything, and then as the next 2 hours, students started to come in, populate the classroom. You blend all those shots. So we had to set that one up. So everything's just kind of situational.
Wow. So you basically set your camera up and didn't move it for like 2 hours just to
Correct.
keep that
Yep.
composition. Yeah.
Because it was the only way to get it done. Because if we did it at the end of the day, there would be no students.
Yeah.
And that drastically changes, the equations, as far as, whether there's people or no people in the shots. If there's people in the shots, you sometimes have to compromise on like what your lighting is. If you're shooting, if you're photographing a K through 12 school, for example, you're not just going in and blasting with strobes. So every game plan is a little bit different. You have to, everything is like, I mean, honestly, like just a lot of this stuff is on the fly. And again, I do have some sort of kind of, I was, I guess a cheat code, but I have been looking at buildings for 30 years. So it's a lot, it's benefit. I can make decisions pretty quickly. Whether they're the right or wrong ones, time will tell, but I do make the decisions quickly.
Sterling.
Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I think your photographs are great. The thing I really get a lot out of is what's going through your mind when you do it, and why you did certain things. That's pretty educational to me, and I appreciate that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's most of the game, honestly. Like, when I started out, I did not know very much about professional photography. Like, I learned a lot of the lighting and stuff as I went. But really, if you know how to communicate it, like you can get away with not knowing certain things. And then as the tools kind of, came along, it helped me kind of communicate those better.
Sterling, what was your deliverables to this client? And what was their objective? Was their objective to show off the whole space? Or were they only looking?
No, it's almost never, I would say, especially like when it comes to big firms, they're almost never highlighting the big, like everything, just because they have so many projects. They're really focused on what makes this space particularly unique, right? And so, this is an adaptive reuse project. And so this is something that they use to market, like with all their adaptive reuse. So they're showing, okay, this is what we did. And honestly, they probably had a limited budget with this, like, there's really not much in the way of like, too many wall. This stair is not fancy whatsoever. They're using like a lot of the, they're using like a lot of the light, and then they're just using like, a lot of like different graphics. But like everything is here is pretty simple. And so here they're highlighting. Yes, this is actually honestly like probably the one bit of architecture that they really truly did. Honestly, is the staircase. Everything else is really interior architecture and integrating graphics, And so a lot of that was a shoot, which is why she was nervous, because that was a huge part of the shoot. And we hadn't done very much of it for that first half of the day.
I'm an architect too, and I've done a lot of marketing through the years.
Mm-hmm.
And whether I was marketing for a construction company or an architecture firm, we dug through all kinds of details that might relate to the presentation we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
For a website or marketing materials, to just say, well, we did this project, 2 or 3 or 4 shots, that tells the story.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're putting together something to show off for a presentation, I mean, we'd use bathroom details, every kind of detail imaginable, saying this is the kind of finish that we would give you in this area. These are the kind of cabinets that we would give you. These are the kind of, hardware we'd use, and so forth. So I'm in a habit with my clients of getting that 5 or 6 killer wham shots, but then I take 40 more shots of all the details.
Right.
And at least my clients really like getting a whole mess of details as well as the 4 or 5 killer shots.
Yeah, I think
So
it just depends on, I think it depends on your type of clients. Honestly, like I would say most of my clients are, I mean, nowadays are pretty much like this, where it's they're showing, I think, usually I'm shooting between 12 and 15 shots. If it's a big shoot, it'll be multiple days or whatever. But like, typically they're 12 to 15 shots. There's usually very little in the way of like an actual detail sort of thing. But also, like some, they're using, it also depends what they're using this for, right? Like they're using this for like their overall marketing. They're using this for AI design awards, sort of thing. So there are other firms that I work with. Maybe they don't necessarily have an extensive portfolio and will go into the bathroom to photograph it, or they need to use something for proposals. So it really, honestly, like it just depends on the focus of their marketing.
I'd have to agree with you, Sterling, as far as the nature of the firm, that the bigger the firm, the fewer the shots that they're interested in. And
Yes.
and the more complex the shots are that the bigger firms are interested in. And to do a shot like this, I think 12 to 15 shots of this complexity is really ambitious for a day. Really ambitious for a day.
The other thing is yeah, that's true, but this was really the only space that we really had to deal with. I mean, yes, there were other spaces that had natural light, but there's not a lot of natural light that's happening in this building. And because of that, it goes a lot faster, right? If I had 12 to 15 shots and I had to deal with variable lighting like this, total nightmare. Like you have to decide when you're going to do something and what kind of lighting you're going to do and how you're going to white balance everything out. With this, all those other shots that we took, there was not much to it in term. Like we set up an umbrella or two, and that was it. And you matched the color balance.
Thanks for listening to AIAP Show and Tell. Subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any new episodes. Today's broadcast is copyrighted by the Association of Independent Architectural Photographers.